On March 19th, 2026, General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood at a Pentagon podium alongside Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and confirmed something the U.S. military had been quietly testing in combat for the first time. American forces had dropped 5,000-pound penetrator weapons directly into underground Iranian storage facilities, holding coastal defense cruise missiles and related support equipment. These weren't just heavier versions of existing bombs. They were GBU-72 Advanced 5K penetrators, a brand new precision-guided bunker buster making its combat debut in that exact strike, specifically engineered to punch through concrete and rock before detonating deep inside a target that was never supposed to be reachable at all. Kane described these weapons in blunt, direct language, saying they were bespokely designed to defeat exactly the kind of hardened, buried infrastructure Iran had spent decades building, specifically because it assumed that infrastructure would always be safe. That single Pentagon briefing captured something much bigger than one successful strike. It captured the entire premise of this war's most important underground contest, a decades-long Iranian bet that burying weapons deep enough into mountains and reinforced concrete would keep them permanently out of reach, and a very deliberate American effort to prove the bet wrong, one bomb at a time. So let's walk through exactly how that contest has actually played out, because the real story is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than a simple headline about a big bomb hitting a bunker. If you want to keep following exactly how this underground battle keeps evolving, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's genuinely more to this story every single week. And once you've made it through this breakdown, drop a comment and tell me whether you think depth and concrete can still protect a modern arsenal against weapons like this, because the honest answer might surprise you. This wasn't even the first time an underground missile storage site had been exposed and struck in this broader conflict either. Back in June of the previous year, Israeli Air Force jets, guided by military intelligence, had already struck a separate underground site containing storage tunnels for surface-to-surface missiles and cruise missiles, complete with multiple launch shafts built directly into the facility. That particular site had actually been revealed publicly beforehand through an Iranian propaganda video, one that had been produced specifically to showcase the facility's capabilities, featuring appearances from senior Iranian military leadership, who, by the time Israel actually struck the site, had already been eliminated in earlier phases of the conflict. There's a strange, almost self-defeating pattern buried in that sequence of events. A regime so confident in the protection its underground infrastructure provided that it felt comfortable showing it off in a propaganda video, only for that same footage to end up helping identify and confirm the exact location that got struck not long afterward. It's a pattern that's repeated in different forms throughout this entire war. Iran's own instinct to project strength and capability publicly repeatedly ending up providing exactly the kind of confirmation and detail that made it easier for adversaries to locate and target the very infrastructure that publicity was meant to celebrate. Let's start with why Iran built its weapons program this way in the first place. Because none of what's happened since makes sense without understanding the original strategy. Iran maintains something in the range of 30 separate underground missile bases constructed over decades and buried into the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges that run across large portions of the country. These aren't shallow bunkers dug a few meters below the surface. According to detailed investigative reporting, these facilities sit at depths ranging from 400 to as much as 1,500 feet into solid granite bedrock, connected by more than 100 interconnected tunnel systems that allow missiles, launchers, and support equipment to move between chambers without ever needing to surface. Some of these complexes feature automated rail transport systems and compartmentalized blast-resistant doors, engineering choices that tell you Iran wasn't just hiding weapons underground, it was building an entire self-contained logistics network designed to survive exactly the kind of sustained bombing campaign it's now actually facing. For years, this strategy worked almost by default, simply because no adversary had ever seriously tested whether it could actually reach facilities buried that deep with any real consistency. That assumption started collapsing almost immediately once this war began. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated offensive against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury on the American side, and Operation Roaring Lion on the Israeli side, opening with strikes against military installations, nuclear enrichment facilities, and senior Iranian leadership, including the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei within the opening hours of the campaign. Iran responded almost immediately under an operation it called True Promise of Four, extending the war's geographic footprint to 7 different countries within just 48 hours, striking Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq, in a wave of retaliation that made clear from the very first days that this wasn't going to be a contained, limited conflict. And right from the start, one of the central battlegrounds of this entire war became exactly the underground missile infrastructure Iran had spent decades building, because both sides understood that whoever controlled the outcome of that specific fight would largely determine how long Iran could sustain any kind of meaningful military resistance. The early results looked genuinely devastating for Iran. According to figures from the Israeli Defense Forces, Israel destroyed roughly 200 of Iran's estimated 470 ballistic missile launchers outright, while another 80 were assessed as inoperable after the entrances to their underground storage facilities were sealed shut by repeated strikes. Defense Secretary Hegseth told reporters at one point that the bombing campaign had, in his words, functionally destroyed Iran's missile program and rendered its military combat ineffective for years to come. That's abundant confidence coming from the very top of the American defense establishment, and for a while, immediately following those comments, the visible evidence circulating in the press seemed to back that confidence up almost entirely. Commercial satellite imagery from providers like Planet Labs, Airbus Maxar, and Sentinel-2 captured extraordinary detail throughout this campaign. Crater formations stacked on top of each other at tunnel entrances, structural collapse visible from orbit, secondary explosions triggered by detonating missile fuel and rocket propellant hidden inside connected underground chambers, and thermal signatures lingering for days after individual strikes. This became, by any measure, one of the most transparently documented underground warfare campaigns ever observed by independent analysts, because for the first time, commercial satellite technology existed at a level of detail and frequency that let ordinary researchers track this kind of subterranean conflict almost in real time, without needing to rely entirely on classified intelligence briefings from either government involved. One of the most heavily targeted single locations throughout this entire campaign was the Sofe Mountain Missile Complex south of Isfahan, sometimes referred to as Iran's underground missile city. This facility absorbed nearly 20 separate bunker-buster strikes from both B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and B-52 Stratofortress aircraft over the course of the war, an extraordinary concentration of firepower against a single target that tells you exactly how seriously American and Israeli planners viewed the threat sitting inside that mountain. Several of those strikes triggered exactly the kind of dramatic secondary explosions you'd expect from detonating fuel and ammunition stores, hidden within the connected underground sections, fireballs and shockwaves, visible on satellite thermal imaging, that confirmed real ordnance was actually being destroyed deep inside the complex, not just surface infrastructure. And yet, despite nearly 20 separate strikes using some of the most powerful conventional weapons in the entire American arsenal, the deepest interior chambers of that facility, buried inside granite formations running hundreds of meters underground, appeared to remain largely resistant to total destruction. Even the most advanced penetrators available simply struggled to consistently reach compartments buried that deep, which tells you something important about the actual physical limits of even America's most powerful bunker-busting technology, when it's tested against exactly the kind of hardened target it was theoretically designed to defeat. Think about it a little like trying to permanently stop water from flowing through a riverbed by dropping boulders into it. You can absolutely block the channel, sometimes for days or even weeks at a stretch, and the disruption is real and costly every single time it happens. But water is patient, and given enough time and enough pressure building up behind the blockage, it tends to find a way around, over, or eventually straight through whatever obstacle got placed in its path. Iran's underground missile network has behaved in something close to that same way throughout this entire war. Every tunnel entrance that gets cratered and buried represents a genuine temporary victory, forcing Iranian engineers to spend real time, real fuel, and real manpower clearing debris before that specific access point becomes usable again. But unless the interior chambers themselves get destroyed, and the evidence increasingly suggests those deepest chambers are exactly the part of this equation that's proven hardest to reliably reach, sealing an entrance only ever buys time rather than delivering the kind of permanent, irreversible destruction that headlines about functional destruction and combat ineffectiveness tend to imply. This is where the story gets genuinely more complicated than a simple narrative of American technological dominance, and it's worth being completely honest about it, because the full picture actually makes this conflict far more interesting than either side's public statements alone would suggest. About a month into the war, sources familiar with American intelligence assessments told Reuters that the United States could only confirm with real certainty that it had destroyed roughly a third of Iran's vast missile arsenal. The status of another third remained genuinely unclear, with intelligence suggesting bombings had likely damaged, destroyed, or simply buried those missiles somewhere inside Iran's tunnel and bunker network, without providing definitive confirmation either way. That's a meaningful gap between the kind of sweeping public statements about functional destruction and combat ineffectiveness, and the much more cautious, uncertain picture painted by the classified intelligence actually informing those statements behind the scenes. One source specifically pointed to the core difficulty driving that uncertainty, that nobody outside Iran ever had a fully reliable estimate of how large the country's pre-war missile stockpile actually was in the first place, which makes claiming any precise percentage destroyed an inherently shaky exercise, no matter how much satellite imagery and strike data gets collected along the way. And then, just as the war seemed to be settling towards some kind of resolution, satellite imagery started revealing something that should genuinely reshape how you think about the entire underground bombing campaign. As American and Israeli strikes had spent weeks specifically targeting the physical access points into these missile complexes, destroying roads leading to tunnel entrances and burying those entrances under tons of rubble and debris, Iran began responding with almost shockingly simple countermeasures. At one base outside Isfahan, satellite images reviewed by CNN showed at least 18 separate craters stacked around a pair of tunnel entrances, direct visual evidence of just how many munitions had been expended trying to permanently seal those specific access points. By early May, though, a new satellite image showed something remarkable: a dump truck actively filling in those very craters, part of a visible, ongoing effort to reopen the tunnel Iran had spent weeks watching get systematically buried. The other two entrances at that same facility had already been fully reopened by that point, and the access roads leading to them, previously cratered and rendered impassable by earlier bombing runs, had already been repaved and restored to full functionality. At a separate facility near Khmeini, satellite imagery captured in mid-April showed at least 10 different construction vehicles simultaneously working to clear a single tunnel entrance, a level of organized, methodical effort that makes clear this wasn't some improvised, desperate scramble, but a genuinely planned reconstruction operation with equipment and manpower already staged and ready to go. Analysts studying this pattern concluded something that carries real weight for how this entire underground contest should actually be understood: that Iran's missile capability simply can't be permanently destroyed just by targeting tunnel entrances, no matter how many bombs get dropped on those specific access points. Bulldozers, dump trucks, and basic excavation equipment turned out to be surprisingly effective tools for countering an air campaign that had cost billions of dollars and involved some of the most sophisticated precision weapons ever developed. That's a genuinely humbling lesson buried inside all of this satellite imagery: that raw physical determination and fairly ordinary construction machinery can meaningfully blunt the effectiveness of even the most advanced bunker-busting weapons in the world, at least when it comes to keeping access points functional rather than actually protecting everything stored deep inside the mountain itself. Separately, broader analysis of the overall bombing campaign has suggested that Operation Epic Fury managed to strike roughly 77% of the visible tunnel entrances Iran was known to be operating throughout the underground missile network. That's a genuinely significant percentage, striking more than 3/4 of every single known access point into this entire hardened infrastructure system in a relatively short window of sustained fighting. But American intelligence subsequently acknowledged, according to multiple reports, that the campaign had actually overestimated the real damage inflicted by at least 50% compared to what post-strike assessments eventually confirmed. That gap between initial battle damage assessments and the more sober, corrected picture that emerged weeks and months later tells you something important about how genuinely difficult it is to accurately measure success against this kind of deeply buried, self-contained infrastructure in real time. You can watch a tunnel entrance collapse on satellite imagery and reasonably assume the facility behind it has been rendered useless, only to discover months later that Iranian engineers had already cleared that exact entrance and restored full operational access within hours, using pre-positioned excavation equipment specifically kept on hand for exactly this scenario. There's also a wider international dimension worth folding into this story, because the lessons emerging from Iran's underground missile campaign extend well beyond just this single conflict. Military planners in countries around the world that maintain their own hardened, buried infrastructure, from North Korea's extensive tunnel networks to various underground facilities scattered across other parts of the Middle East and Asia, have almost certainly been studying every detail of how this specific contest has unfolded, from the GBU-72's combat debut to the surprisingly effective use of ordinary bulldozers to reopen bombed tunnel entrances. Every satellite image showing a crater successfully filled in, every confirmed instance of Iranian engineers restoring full functionality to a previously sealed missile base becomes a genuine data point informing how other governments think about the actual survivability of their own underground military assets. And on the other side of that same equation, every confirmed instance of an American penetrator successfully reaching a target that previous generation weapons couldn't touch becomes an equally important data point for exactly those same governments to weigh when deciding whether their own hardened infrastructure investments still make strategic sense going forward. This underground contest between Iran and its adversaries isn't just determining the outcome of one specific war anymore, it's actively shaping how militaries around the world think about the entire concept of underground survivability heading into whatever conflicts come next. Now, it would be a mistake to swing too far in the other direction and conclude that none of this underground bombing campaign actually mattered, because that's simply not what the evidence shows either. Even with all of that uncertainty and Iran's demonstrated ability to reopen sealed tunnel entrances using basic construction equipment, Central Command confirmed that American strikes had hit more than 10,000 separate Iranian military targets by roughly the 1-month mark of the war. An almost staggering figure that speaks to the sheer scale and intensity of this sustained campaign. During that same period, Central Command also confirmed it had sunk 92% of the Iranian Navy's large vessels, a level of naval devastation that dwarfs almost any comparable modern conflict, and demonstrates that whatever limitations existed against deeply buried missile infrastructure, those same limitations clearly didn't apply nearly as severely to targets sitting exposed at surface level or in open water. The picture that actually emerges from all of this isn't one of total American failure against Iran's underground weapons program, and it's not one of complete, unqualified success either. It's something genuinely more nuanced, a campaign that achieved extraordinary measurable success against surface infrastructure and shallower buried targets, while running directly into the hard physical limits of what even the most advanced conventional weapons can guarantee against the deepest, most heavily engineered portions of Iran's underground missile network. There's also a raw economic dimension to this contest that rarely gets the attention it deserves, because the cost asymmetry here is genuinely striking once you actually stop and think about it. A single GBU-72 or GBU-57 represents an enormous financial investment, the product of years of specialized engineering, precision manufacturing, and an entire supporting infrastructure of stealth aircraft, intelligence gathering, and mission planning required just to deliver it accurately to the right coordinates. Iran's response to having one of those weapons detonate near a tunnel entrance, by contrast, has repeatedly amounted to sending in a handful of ordinary construction vehicles, the exact same kind of bulldozers and dump trucks used on civilian infrastructure projects anywhere in the world, and simply digging the debris back out over the course of a few days. That cost asymmetry matters enormously for how sustainable this entire underground contest actually is over the long run. The United States can keep manufacturing and delivering increasingly sophisticated penetrating weapons, but each one carries a real, substantial price tag and a limited production rate. Iran, meanwhile, has shown it can counter a meaningful portion of that investment with equipment that costs a tiny fraction as much and can be sourced from almost any construction supplier anywhere in the country, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about whether a purely munitions-based strategy can ever fully resolve this specific underground standoff on its own, no matter how advanced the individual weapons involved eventually become. Let's go back to that GBU-72 for a moment, because understanding exactly what this weapon represents helps explain why the Pentagon felt it was worth specifically highlighting at a press briefing rather than just folding it quietly into the broader daily strike reports. The GBU-72 was developed specifically to replace the GBU-28, a bunker buster that had actually been in continuous American service since 1991, meaning the weapon it replaced had been in the arsenal for roughly 3.5 decades before finally being phased out in favor of something purpose-built for the exact kind of deeply buried, hardened targets that older generation of weapons increasingly struggled to reliably defeat. The GBU-72 uses GPS guidance paired with a high explosive warhead specifically optimized for detonating after penetration rather than on impact, meaning, much like its much larger cousin, the GBU-57, it's engineered to survive the initial collision with concrete or rock completely intact and continue driving downward before actually triggering its warhead at the depth where the real target sits. Air Force officials have said they expect this weapon to offer substantially higher lethality against exactly the category of deeply buried and fortified targets that Iran's entire underground missile doctrine was built around defeating conventional airstrikes in the first place. What makes the GBU-72's combat debut particularly significant is the target category it was actually used against in that specific March strike, underground storage facilities holding coastal defense cruise missiles positioned near the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a random target selection. Coastal defense cruise missiles represent one of the most direct, immediate threats to the exact commercial shipping lanes and naval operations that have sat at the absolute center of this entire war from the very beginning. By specifically confirming that this new penetrator had been used against exactly that category of underground storage, General Kane was sending a fairly direct signal that the United States now possessed a weapon specifically capable of reaching one of the most operationally significant categories of hidden Iranian firepower, the missiles most directly threatening the safe movement of ships through the strait that this entire conflict has repeatedly returned to as its central strategic prize. Kane also noted during that same briefing that American forces were continuing to expand operations further eastward into Iranian airspace, hunting one-way attack drone units and working to eliminate remaining maritime threats, while continuing to hunt and destroy mine storage facilities and naval ammunition depots scattered across the broader region. A reminder that the underground weapons contest wasn't limited to missile bunkers alone, but extended into virtually every category of hidden military infrastructure Iran had spent years quietly building. There's also something worth understanding about the broader intelligence assessment surrounding Iran's remaining capability, even after everything that's happened throughout this war. because the picture painted by officials speaking on background often looks quite different from the confident, sweeping statements delivered in public press briefings. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, American officials have acknowledged that Iran retains the ability to dig out or repair a meaningful number of the launchers that were either damaged or buried underground during the American and Israeli bombing campaign. Iran also still possesses thousands of medium and short-range ballistic missiles that can be retrieved from storage spaces both above and below ground, even accounting for roughly half of its existing stockpile having already been used or destroyed throughout the fighting. And while a similar proportion of Iran's drone inventory has reportedly been consumed or destroyed, American and Israeli officials have separately warned that Iran retains the option of simply purchasing replacement drones from Russia, a potential resupply pathway that complicates any assumption that battlefield attrition alone will permanently resolve this specific threat. The Israeli Defense Forces have separately emphasized that the single most significant blow delivered throughout this entire bombing campaign wasn't necessarily the destruction of existing stockpiled weapons at all, but rather the damage inflicted on Iran's actual weapons production industry itself, with assessments suggesting Iran currently cannot produce meaningful quantities of new missiles domestically in the aftermath of this sustained campaign. That distinction matters enormously when you're trying to understand the real long-term trajectory of this underground weapons contest. Destroying existing stockpiles, even imperfectly, still leaves open the question of how quickly an adversary can simply manufacture replacements. If Iran's actual production capacity has genuinely been crippled, even a partially surviving underground stockpile becomes a depleting, non-renewable resource rather than something that can simply be quietly rebuilt over time, the same way Iran has demonstrated it can reopen a bulldozed tunnel entrance within days, using nothing more sophisticated than construction equipment already sitting on hand. Let's talk honestly about what all of this actually tells us about the broader question sitting at the heart of this entire story, whether depth and hardened construction can genuinely still protect a modern military arsenal against the kind of precision weapons the United States and Israel brought to bear throughout this campaign, a question that matters far beyond just this single war. The answer, based on everything documented across this war so far, is genuinely mixed rather than a clean win for either side of that argument. Tunnel entrances, access roads, and the shallower storage chambers closer to the surface have proven consistently vulnerable, reachable by both the massive 30,000-pound GBU-57 and the more surgical purpose-built GBU-72, and capable of being sealed shut, at least temporarily, through repeated, sustained bombing. But the deepest interior chambers, buried hundreds of meters into solid granite at sites like the Safa mountain complex, have repeatedly demonstrated a level of resilience that even nearly 20 separate heavy bunker buster strikes couldn't fully overcome. And perhaps most importantly, Iran's demonstrated ability to physically reopen and repair damaged access points using nothing more sophisticated than bulldozers and dump trucks reveals a genuinely uncomfortable truth for military planners everywhere, that permanently neutralizing this kind of hardened underground infrastructure may require an entirely different, far more sustained strategy than simply cratering entrances and declaring victory based on initial satellite imagery. There's also something worth noting about how differently the two governments have chosen to communicate about this entire underground contest to their own domestic audiences, because the contrast tells you something about how each side manages public expectations during a war this long and this technically complicated. American officials have generally leaned towards specific, headline-grabbing claims of functional destruction and combat ineffectiveness, statements that project confidence and closure. Iranian state media, by contrast, has repeatedly emphasized resilience and reconstruction, publicizing footage of restored tunnel entrances and rebuilt access roads as proof that the underground doctrine ultimately works exactly as designed. Both narratives contain real elements of truth, and both also conveniently leave out the messier, more complicated parts of the story that don't fit quite as cleanly into a single triumphant headline, which is exactly why independent satellite imagery and careful outside analysis have ended up being so essential to actually understanding what's happened here. Here's the honesty check worth sitting with as we bring this all together. Because it would be easy to walk away from this story believing either that American bunker-busting technology has definitively proven capable of reaching anything buried anywhere, or conversely that Iran's underground doctrine has essentially defeated the most advanced conventional weapons on the planet. Neither conclusion actually fits the documented evidence. What actually happened is something more instructive than either simple narrative, a genuine ongoing arms race playing out in real time between American penetrating weapons technology and Iranian hardened construction and rapid repair doctrine, with each side adapting to specific lessons learned from the other throughout the course of this war. The GBU-72's combat debut against coastal missile storage represents a real, meaningful advance in America's ability to reach underground targets that previous generation weapons simply couldn't reliably defeat with anywhere near the same level of consistency or confidence. Iran's demonstrated ability to reopen bulldozed tunnel entrances within days represents an equally real, meaningful countermeasure that complicates any assumption of permanent, total underground destruction achieved purely through air power alone. Both of those things are simultaneously true, and understanding this war accurately means holding both of those realities in mind at once, rather than collapsing the story into whichever version makes for a cleaner, more satisfying headline for whichever side you happen to be rooting for. What happens next in this specific underground contest really depends on whether the current tentative agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz actually holds long enough to make the question moot, or whether hostilities resume and put this entire arms race back into active testing once again. Analysts studying Iran's ongoing reconstruction efforts have specifically warned that Tehran could retain a genuinely significant missile capability if fighting does pick back up, precisely because so much of its underground infrastructure, even the portions that were struck and damaged, has proven repairable rather than permanently destroyed. That's a sobering conclusion for anyone hoping this war has definitively settled the question of whether buried, hardened weapons infrastructure can survive a sustained modern air campaign. The honest answer, based on everything documented across this conflict so far, is that it depends enormously on exactly how deep, exactly how hardened, and exactly how quickly the country on the receiving end of the bombs is willing and able to dig itself back out. A calculation that Iran has now tested in live combat conditions more thoroughly than perhaps any other nation in recent memory, and one that other governments watching from a distance are almost certainly running through their own strategic planning right now. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. Given that American forces have now demonstrated real ability to reach underground missile storage with purpose-built weapons like the GBU-72, but Iran has simultaneously demonstrated real ability to physically repair and reopen damaged tunnel entrances within days using nothing more sophisticated than construction equipment, do you think this underground contest ultimately favors whichever side has the more advanced penetrating weapons, or whichever side has the greater raw determination and manpower to simply keep digging itself back out no matter how many times it gets bombed and how many resources it has to keep pouring into that effort? I'd genuinely like to hear where you land on that in the comments below, because there are compelling arguments running in both directions once you actually look closely at everything documented throughout this war. If this breakdown helped you understand why a story about bunker buster bombs turned out to be so much more complicated than a simple headline about American technological dominance, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed coverage reach more people trying to actually understand what's happening underneath the surface of this entire conflict, quite literally, rather than settling for whichever soundbite happened to make the evening news that particular day. And if you want to stay updated as this underground contest keeps evolving, because it clearly isn't finished yet, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Share this with anyone you know who's been hearing headlines about bunker buster bombs and underground missile bases without realizing just how genuinely back and forth this specific fight has actually been. Because the real story sitting underneath all of it is a lot more interesting and a lot more uncertain than any single confident press briefing on either side would ever lead you to believe. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.